It seems so long ago now that it's almost surreal to remember sitting down in the Kingston Odeon 11 years ago to watch Iron Man and being blown away by everything really in that film. The performances, the directing, the humour of it, how the action sequences turned out, watching superheroes really do what they'd always done in the comics. But most of all, that feeling of excitement of the MCU beginning with that stinger sequence where Samuel L. Jackson shows up as Nick Fury, and just knowing there were going to be more films like this. It's surreal to look back at that in the context of everything that's happened in the MCU since, everything that Marvel's done to the film industry, everything that Disney's done to consolidate their hold in the film industry. It's surreal, especially to look back at it knowing that that's essentially finished. And there is a really strong sense of finality in Avengers Endgame. I went to go see this in the Odeon in Lincoln. It's a really standard multiplex. I saw a midday screening. It was the Sunday after release, and it was completely rammed. I mean, I literally haven't ever been to the cinema when it's been like that. It was totally sold out. There wasn't a spare seat in our entire screening, and people were queuing up outside to get in. Why, I don't exactly know. They'd book tickets for the seats, but fair, whatever you want to do, gang, you're all good. There was a palpable sense of, if not excitement, expectation, and it's not hard to see why, right? This is the end game, get it? See what I did there? Of a decade of marketing movies as product. Stories that are sometimes unfinished, usually funny, occasionally interesting, but very connected. And hey, if you didn't like this one, the way we told this character's story here, then don't worry, we'll change it in the next one, or we'll fill in the blanks with some connective tissue in a different movie. It's a series of movies that's really transformed a generation of filmgoers into grandmas watching soaps, really, except they swapped out the hair rollers for spandex. I was sat there in my seat thinking, here's a movie that 12-year-old me would be going wild for, that they would be so excited and interested in. And instead, I'm a 27-year-old sitting here feeling trepidatious, a little bored, and definitely unexcited, uninterested. I know these are movies that people get really excited about, and especially for young audiences, I think they're really kind of fun and interesting. I know that people take them a little too seriously sometimes. By that, I don't mean they're having strong critical debates around it, which I think is fair game. What I mean is that they kind of send you death threats for saying you don't like a Marvel movie or something like that. So, you know, there's a fair amount of that stuff, and it totally confuses me that adults would do that kind of thing, because why you would pick as the hill to die on a property that's owned by the biggest media corporation in the world, basically, is slightly beyond me, but hey, different strokes, different folks, turn the world around, something like that, yada yada. Please don't send me death threats for this video, thanks, cheers. When I think about the MCU and my feelings around it, it's really summed up by the idea of a loss of potential. I think some of the Marvel movies are really good, and especially for modern action blockbusters, they often have really interesting ideas and directorial approaches in them. The problem is that that's largely confined to the first phase of movies. Phase 1 is basically all bangers, let's be clear about it. Iron Man 1 is a cracking movie, a classic of the superhero genre. Captain America, the first Avenger, I really love it. I know some people don't, but I think it's got a really interesting directorial style and a very heartfelt central performance and character arc. Thor doesn't really do it for me, but I understand that it's a good enough movie. I know some people like it, so maybe there's something I'm just not getting about it. But more than being just individual good movies, there's a sense that they're trying to approach their subject matter in an interesting, funny, and well-meaning way. There's something not that cynical about those films, which is really refreshing, even looking back at them now. Unfortunately, after the colossal success of The Avengers, or Avengers Assemble as it's known in the UK, there seems to have been this kind of shift in how Marvel made their films, and you have to think that it's about the fact that Avengers essentially redefined what it is for a movie to make money. After Avengers, it seems like the MCU really became about bland, nondescript banter, and TV directing became a really standard way for the films to be covered, basically. It's also where the MCU as a concept started to have some trouble, because previously the films stood on their own but were connected, which is a really stimulating and interesting way of covering stories like that. That's the most comic booky thing about the MCU, because it really mirrors how the plots of the different superhero books interact. They don't really touch up against each other, but events that happen in their world happen in each other's books. You only have to look to something like Avengers Age of Ultron to see where that concept got stretched too far, because we have an entire subplot about Thor that's basically resolved in another movie. It's fine, Will. Movies have to be like TV. Every plot has to run over into the next episode. Come back for Days of Our Superhero Lives soon. So despite the excitement of the crowd, and especially there being like young filmgoers in the audience, which is always a really good sign, I can't help but feel kind of sad that that audience is so full for something so devoid of substance, especially in the context of all the media consolidation that Disney's been doing recently. I was counting the trailers before the film. There were 8 trailers shown, 6 of which are now owned by Disney or its subsidiaries, which really drives home to you the problem with modern blockbusters. But anyway, enough digression. Let's talk about Avengers Endgame. The film opens with a really well-executed, well-acted, well-directed, well-written scene where Hawkeye loses his entire family to Thanos' snap. It's exactly the kind of scene that you want to open a sequel because it effectively reminds the audience of the tone and also the stakes for the characters, while expanding the backstory, starting to justify what was happening kind of off-screen, rounded about, and it really just gives a wider scope that feels kind of comic booky, like an epic crossover, which is of course what you want for an MCU movie. Slightly disappointingly, immediately following that, the interesting villain of Infinity War gets killed off by the main characters, including Captain Marvel, who shows up here and then isn't in the entirety of the rest of the film until, again, the last 5 minutes of the movie. She shows up and just acts as a kind of reset button twice in the film, which really reminds me of the terrible writing for Vision in Avengers Age of Ultron. And then again, we get another time jump to 5 years after the snap, and the film has completely lost its narrative impetus here. It's really about something somber, slow, dark, and reflective. Until Ant-Man shows up and they develop a time travel machine, and then the whole thing becomes kind of like a clip show where they go back and do alternate continuity stuff and have lots of like in-jokes, cameos, and reappearances by the famous actors who've been in the rest of the films. That structure ends up being really diffuse and in fact functions basically as an excuse to have lots of continuity porn, some of which lands better than other bits. For example, we start off with a get the band back together kind of sequence where Hulk and Rocket go to New Asgard to find Thor, but tee-hee, he's chubby now. This is a funny joke. Unfortunately, it's the only joke they have for Thor in the entire movie, and it's the only thing he gets to do in the whole film, so I hope you like it because there's 3 hours of it. And then almost immediately following, we have this epic sequence where Hawkeye, now in his identity of Ronin, is tracked down in Tokyo. It's a really beautifully directed action sequence that works out essentially in one take. And it's a perfect example of why the Russo brothers are actually quite capable for directing this sort of movie. Unfortunately, most of the film really isn't set out that cleanly or that well, so it serves kind of as a reminder that you could have a more focused, more interesting film, but because this is a grand finale, you kind of have to moderate your expectations. After all, look at how many people are on this poster. This isn't even all of the characters who are in the film. How can you possibly hope to have loads of really interesting sequences when you have so many characters you can't even begin to start telling stories for each one of them? After they've had their little reunion, the film kicks off the time travel plot and we really start delving into what is essentially the meat of the film, about 90 minutes worth of people just going back to scenes that are in previous films to kind of work out alternate continuities of what went on. Like I said before, some of these sequences work better than others. A good example is the Battle of New York, when they travel back to 2012 New York during the invasion by the Chitauri? Kitori? We basically have the classic Avengers here. We've got Tony, Steve, Bruce, and then we've also got Ant-Man along. And that allows the characters to interact with prior versions of themselves, but also stories that are really closely identifiable. So we end up with a really fun sequence where Cap gets into a lift with a bunch of agents who we now know are Hydra agents at the time, but previously thought were S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. And there's a send-off of the amazing lift sequence in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, only this time it plays out completely differently. That's a really fun thing that the filmmakers are able to do, playing with our retroactive recognition of sequences and subverting expectations. Another example of that is when Bruce goes to chat with the old one, Tilda Swinton's character from Doctor Strange. Now this is the whole mystical side of the MCU that wasn't established at all at this point in the continuity, but now has been. So they're able to retroactively go back and fill in some blanks about what was happening during famous sequences in other bits of the MCU. Really good fun. The other 2 major time travel sequences are far less interesting. We get Thor in his fat suit going back to Asgard during the setting of Thor: The Dark World, which I can't remember anything about. I don't know if anyone else can, but for me, that movie is just gone. So what this section of the film essentially entails is shots of the back of Natalie Portman's head, because she obviously didn't want to be in the film, some deleted footage from Thor: The Dark World, and Thor having a chat with his mum, a kind of reunion, because that should be kind of sad because she dies, but actually she just makes fun of him for being chubby and depressed, so ultimately they kind of ruin that moment. We also get Tash and Hawkeye, and then Nebula and Rhodey, which, by the way, weird pairing, going back to like the period of the first Guardians of the Galaxy film, and trotting around an alien planet. Now the issue with this is that the time travel element really doesn't come off as strongly because we're on an alien planet anyway, so it's already a little disorientating. And for most of this sequence, they're also not interacting with past versions of themselves because they weren't there at this point, so it's not that interesting. This is also where one of the weaker points of the film starts to develop. Remember I said that Thanos dies in the first 15 minutes? You know, Thanos, who is one of the more interesting things about Infinity War, a really well-developed, well-thought-through anti-villain who essentially is a bad guy who thinks he's doing the right thing and is obviously incredibly tortured by some aspect of that, like losing his daughter. That Thanos, he dies 15 minutes in. So instead they get the Thanos who is totally underdeveloped. I mean, literally doesn't have that character development from 2014, and he travels back to the modern day. So that's where they get their villain from, because I guess they needed one after they killed off the other guy. I don't know, that strikes me as shoddy screenwriting. You're literally saying, we've built up this really interesting character, we're gonna kill him off to really shock the audience. And then you bring back like a shittier version of him to have in the film because you need someone to be leading these like hordes of baddies that you need for your climactic sequence. Kind of sucks. This is one of my pet peeves with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because everyone who watches it and likes it makes such a big claim about how well connected the universe is, but actually those connections very rarely factor into long-term character development or into decisions that affect the characters and their plots in the next movies that they're in. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Age of Ultron, Thor ends up heading off on this quest to discover what was at the center of these omens that he had, that Asgard was going to be destroyed. And this takes up a lot of the runtime of the film. I mean, I was actually expecting that to pay off in the climax of that movie. By the time Thor Ragnarok rolls around, they've got a different director attached, they've changed Thor's character quite a lot. And most of what he was expected to do at the end of that previous film, he does in the first 5 minutes of Ragnarok. And really, the prophecy doesn't play into the film that much. I mean, it plays into the very final conclusion of the movie, but literally the rest of the movie takes place on another planet with other people doing other things. It has very little to do with the plot of the film. Another example that also stems from Age of Ultron. At the end of Age of Ultron, the Vision is created, who is this kind of ultra-powerful robot guy. The next big movie in the sequence is Civil War, where all of the characters are picking sides on whether or not superheroes should have to register with the government in order to be able to operate. Sounds like the kind of thing that like an almost omnipotent, deity-like robot ghost superhero being would kind of have to weigh in on, right? Wrong. He ends up making chicken paprikash in the kitchen with his girlfriend for the entirety of the movie until the very last fight sequence that actually has all the characters in it. So that's my question. What's the point of having such a connected universe if stuff doesn't really pay off? Even this movie has problems with this, despite being the grand finale of the MCU. Captain Marvel, who, if you remember, had her movie come out like a month ago, is in the film. She features on all of the posters, but she's literally in like 5 minutes of the movie in total. She shows up, is very powerful, and everyone thinks she's really cool, and then she disappears. And she comes back at the end and is very powerful, and everyone thinks she's really cool. Now, if you remember in Captain Marvel, the vast majority of the runtime is a kind of buddy comedy between Carol and Nick Fury. And it's really about their growing bond as Nick realizes there are all these great cosmic things out there and there's superheroes and stuff like that, which is, you know, a good idea for a movie, I think, an interesting plot to have. I'm so glad they spent their whole runtime on it because it essentially doesn't figure in this film in any sense whatsoever. Never mind that the last moment of Infinity War is about Nick Fury's last moments of life after being snapped, and the first person he thinks of is Carol. He sends her a text as he's dying saying, "Come back, I need your help, PM me." That's a really strong emotional bond, and that's why Carol comes back to Earth and helps him kill off Thanos. And then she disappears from the film in its entirety. She doesn't even meet up with Nick Fury at the end of the movie when he's been unsnapped. There's not even a single line of dialogue between them. What's the point? What's the point of connecting your universes when you have stuff like that going on? Oh, it's to sell tickets to movies. Right, gotcha. $1.5 billion in its opening weekend. You know, from a purely mercenary point of view, that's good thinking. It's just the writing and the characterization and the plots that have a problem. But from a money point of view, anyway, I really digress. The best thing about the time travel is that it allows for the film to essentially become a big send-off to both Steve and Tony. So at the end of the film, at the Battle of the Five Armies that you kind of need in a big blockbuster like this, which is rammed with cheesy moments that mostly work and are really required for a blockbuster of this size, Carol comes back and she flies through a ship, exploding it, which is kind of her character trademark. You might remember it from the film she was in, Captain Marvel, that came out like a month ago, which featured her doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same context to someone related to the same character, also at the end of the film. You might remember that. I don't know, it came out a month ago. At the end of the film, there's this really heroic moment where Tony finally sacrifices himself to save basically the whole universe. And it's a lovely character arc for the guy who's been at the center of the MCU all the way back to Iron Man, who has had so many struggles with his own ego and being selfish, and finally comes to understand sacrifice, self-sacrifice in that moment. That's a beautiful bit of writing that only a very long-form story like the MCU, or more pertinently maybe, like comics in general, can really tell. Slightly less convincingly, almost immediately following that, Steve travels back in time and shacks up with the woman whose grandniece he smooched in a previous film, which I think is going to make for some really weird, like, family reunions. But that's life in a superhero movie. You know, sometimes you do travel back in time and bang your grandniece. So, buckaroo. This plot point really confused me, to be honest. It was kind of sweet, but it's the kind of thing where if you put any thought into it, it becomes marginally disturbing, and it's best just not to think about it and let it go. The one thing that really threw me is that aged up Steve Rogers looks a lot like Joe Biden, and I just didn't really understand that. If that's stealth marketing for the 2020 presidential campaign. So that's it, the end of an era. Endgame is finished. Overall, I felt like it was slightly less good than Infinity War, although it was probably better structured. It didn't really chop around within the scenes as much as that film did. Although it was set a lot all over the place, all through time, they were able to have longer sequences in those locations, which helped the film feel a lot more cohesive. But now the film's done, and I don't have to think about the MCU for like 2 months before the next one comes out. I wish that wasn't a joke. And so you end up with a Marvel universe that really looks kind of empty at this point. You know, all the classic Avengers have gone. Black Widow's gone, you know, I forgot to tell you, but she died too. Tony's gone, Steve's gone, the Vision's gone, but I don't think anyone really cared about the Vision. So who have we got left? We've got Captain Marvel, who kind of sucks and only seems to have one power, which is being able to do whatever the plot wants her to do. We got Big Green here, and I think Mark Ruffalo has checked out of these films in a quite drastic sense. He's fine in this one, but in Infinity War he really gave up. I'm assuming Hawkeye is going to go back to the ranch and hang out with his family because he's barely been in the other films anyway. Thor's in space with a talking raccoon and a talking tree. So what does the Avengers look like? War Machine. The new Captain America, Falcon, Sam isn't even on this. Ant-Man. We got Doctor Strange. So we're going to have that. Call me crazy, but I wonder if the reason why this film doesn't end with a stinger is because where the fuck are they going to go with Avengers? Who's checking in to be like, oh, I feel really emotionally invested in Ant-Man's journey in this? So that's it. Bish bash bosh, 11 years worth of cinema history, and the lights come up at the end of the kind of designed bit of the credits, and the man in the cinema tells us all to leave because there is no post-credits sequence. There's a lot of rubbish left in the cinema, so I picked it up and took it to the staff because it's really difficult working as a cinema staff member when there's a blockbuster on. The hours are horrible, the audiences are really angry, and management is just trying to get as many screening in as possible, which for a 3-hour film is quite difficult. So I gave the rubbish to them. I went home and had lunch, and I just felt like a great weight lifted off me because I don't have to think about what those stories are going to be like anymore, because they're probably going to suck.